I'm Lizzy Manguso, Sean said, and I've been working on a biomechanics project this past 6 weeks titled The Mechanics of Sit-to-Stand Transitions, a comparison between ertl amputees and healthy individuals. Okay, here's a little bit of background about amputation. There's approximately 2 million amputees living in America. Of the amputations that are performed, the most common is the transtibial or below-the-knee amputation. And transtibial amputations make up about half of all lower limb amputations. And we have 2 methods for performing a transtibial amputation. We have the long posterior flaps method, also called the Burgess, and the osteomyoplastic method, also called the ertl. So about the Burgess method, it's been commonly used since the 1960s, and it's the standard procedure for a transtibial amputation. Now how they do this amputation is they cut the limb at the site of amputation, and they leave open the medullary canal, which is the canal between your tibia and your fibula. Because they leave this canal open, normal pressure is not returned to the area. And because normal pressure is not returned to the area, there's an increased risk of venous stasis. If venous stasis occurs, normal blood flow won't return to the residual limb, which can often cause muscle and tissue degradation. If muscle and tissue degradation occurs, it can often cause the prosthetic to not fit optimally for use. Also, bone spurs are a common postoperative problem with this surgical method. Bone spurs are bony projectile growths off of the amputated bone, and they're a common cause of postoperative pain. So now about the ertl method. It's much less common than the Burgess method. It was first used on World War I veterans in Hungary by Dr. Janis von Ertl. What they do in this surgical procedure is they cut the limb at the site of amputation, and they form a fusion of the tibia and the fibula to form a sort of bone bridge. This bone bridge provides an increased surface area for the amputee to bear weight on. Also, because they're closing the medullary canal, normal pressure is returned. So there's a less chance of venous stasis, and normal blood flow will more likely recur in the residual limb, and therefore there's a less chance of muscle and tissue degradation. Also, bone spurs are much less of a problem with this surgical technique, but despite these benefits, it is a longer and more complicated procedure than the Burgess. So now we have 2 x-rays. On this side we have the Burgess. As you can see, the medullary canal is left open. You can see some bone spurs starting to form. And on this side we have the ertl. There's the bone bridge between the tibia and the fibula, which closes the medullary canal. Okay, so some previous research about transtibial amputees and sit-to-stand transitions. The average transtibial amputee has been found to stand and sit approximately 50 times per day. And as you can all know, sitting and standing is such a common movement in everyday life that it's almost impossible to avoid. So that's why it's so important for us to research this area. Also, when amputees make these transitions, they have been found to rely more on their intact limb rather than on their prosthetic limb. And although this may seem like kind of a helpful adaptation for them to make, this asymmetry can lead to a shift in weight and the need to take an extra step forward or even a fall. So the purpose of this study was to determine if there were still asymmetries present in ertl amputees when making sit-to-stand transitions. And to determine asymmetries, we looked at joint angles in the knee, hip, and ankle, and also at center of pressure in the X range, which is the anterior and posterior or front to back range, and also the Y range, or the medial lateral or side to side range. So as you might imagine, we have to use a lot of technology to test this to perform this experiment. And so here's some of the technology that we use in the lab. Here is one of the 10 Vicon body capture system cameras that we have in the lab. They take the joint angle data. Up here, we have the 2 force plates that we have in the lab, and these collect ground reaction forces and center of pressure data. And right here, you can see a representation of how the lab looks. So here in the middle, you can see the 2 force plates labeled 1 and 2, and these little green squares represent the 10 cameras all angled down towards the force plates in the lab. So for methods, we had an amputee population and a control population. We had 9 controls and 7 amputees. and our controls had no known functional impairments. So when our subjects came into the lab, we took some basic anthropometric measures. So this is like wrist width, knee width, and ankle width. We also took mass and height. All these values were entered into the Vicon computer system, and these values help the computer develop an accurate model of each subject. Next, we placed the 41 Vicon body capture system markers on each subject. And in this diagram, you can see where all of them go. As you can imagine, it takes quite a while to put all of these on a person. And then right here, you can see the representation that the Vicon system makes in the computer of each subject once all the markers are placed. So we also took the fibular head height measure of each subject, which is just a measure from the floor to the head of the fibula. The chair was adjusted to that height for each subject. After that, subjects were instructed to sit and stand as quickly as possible 5 times without use of their hands. And during the trials, we collected the center of pressure data and the joint angle data, and afterwards we analyzed this data for the middle 3 trials. Now for our controls, we only analyzed the left side because controls are assumed to be symmetrical. And for our amputees, we analyzed the intact limb and the amputated limb separately. So here is my peer Dylan, and he is demonstrating what a typical trial might look like. As you can see, he has 1 foot on each force plate. The chair is set up behind the force plates, and he's not using his hands during the transition. And here I have a video of what it looks like in the Vicon system. So as you can see, sit, stand. And then these are the ground reaction forces, the ground reaction force vectors that the Vicon system produces during the sit to stand transition. And that is what a typical trial looks like. Okay, now here we have some results. So before I go into this, I want to emphasize that although we are looking at sitting and standing, we're not comparing them. We're only looking at them separately. So here we have some results of the ankle. These asterisks indicate the finding of a significant difference between limbs. On the y-axis, we have the ankle in degrees. And on the x-axis, we have the intact limb, the amputated limb, and the control limb. Orange bars represent sitting, and blue bars represent standing. So for the maximum angle, we found significant differences during sitting between the intact and the amputated limb, as well as between the amputated and the control limb, as well as between the control and the intact limb. Now for standing, we found significant differences between the intact and amputated limb, as well as between the amputated and the control limb, as well as between the control and the intact limb. So down here we have minimum ankle angle. Again, on the y-axis, angle in degrees, and on the x, intact, amputated, and control. So for sitting, we found significant differences between the intact limb and the control limb, as well as between the control limb and the amputated limb. And for standing, we found significant differences between the amputated limb and the control limb, as well as between the control and the intact limb. So here we have the ankle range of motion, and the range of motion was just found by subtracting the minimum ankle angle from the maximum ankle angle. So again, on the y-axis we have angle in degrees. On the x-axis we have intact, amputated, and control limb. So for the sitting condition, we found significant differences between the control and the amputated, as well as between the amputated and the intact limb. And then for the standing condition, we found significant differences between the intact limb and the amputated limb, as well as between the amputated and the control limb. So here we have the results for the knee. This is the minimum knee angle. Again, angle in degrees, intact, amputated, and control limb. For the sitting condition, we found significant differences between the amputated and the control limb. And for the standing condition, we found significant differences between the control and the amputated limb. Now here we have center of pressure. So center of pressure in the X range excursion. Again, X range is the anterior and posterior range, or the front and backward motion. So for on the y-axis, we have excursion in centimeters. Again, on the x, we have intact, amputated, and control limb. For the sitting condition, we found significant differences between the control and the amputated limb, as well as between the amputated and the intact limb. And for standing, we found significant differences between the control and the amputated limb, as well as between the control and the intact limb. Now we have our results for center of pressure in the Y-range excursion. And the Y-range excursion is the side-to-side range, or the mediolateral range. So for the sitting condition, we found significant differences between the control and the amputated limb. And for the standing condition, we found significant differences between the control and the amputated limb. So that was a lot of data all at once. So an overall finding were we found no significant differences in the hip. However, we did find significant differences in the minimum knee angle, the minimum ankle angle, the maximum ankle angle, the ankle range of motion, and the center of pressure excursion for both the X and Y range. So what does this all mean? Well, first of all, we found no significant differences in the hip, so this suggests that the ertl amputation allows an amputee a relatively normal use of their hip during sit-to-stand transitions. Conversely, we found a lot of significant differences in the ankle, so this suggests that the ertl amputation is not effective in allowing an amputee a relatively normal use of their ankle during sit-to-stand transitions. This also suggests that amputees have an inconsistent strategy to make sit-to-stand transitions. This is supported by previous research and is also supported by, if you look at the ankle data, amputees have much larger standard deviations than controls do. So this suggests that between amputees and between trials, there is much larger variation in ankle angle. This is also suggests that we as controls and healthy people have consistent, reliable strategies for making these transitions, which is again supported by previous research. This can also be explained by the prosthetic ankle joint. So here I have this leg, model of a leg. You can do two flexion with your ankle. You can do plantar flexion like this, where your toes are pointed, or there's dorsiflexion like this. And when you make a sit-to-stand transition, you dorsiflex your ankle and your knee comes over your toes, like so. However, in the prosthetic ankle joint, they don't have the same functional ease that we do, so they have a harder time dorsiflexing your ankle. So rather than being able to make this easy, fluid movement that we can, they're forced to come up farther onto their toes and not have the same range of motion in their ankle. So this explains the differences that we see in the ankle, and this can also explain the differences that we see in the knee. If they're having to come up onto their toes during this transition, when they're fully standing, their knee might not fully straighten all the way, again explaining the minimum knee angle difference that we see. Again, this also explains the X-range excursion that we see. If you have to come up onto your toes during a sit-to-stand transition, your center of pressure is only naturally going to shift forward. So that explains the difference that we see not only between the control and the amputees, but between the between the amputated limb and the intact limb. So this also shows that the ertl is not effective in relieving these asymmetries previously found during sit-to-stand transitions because they still heavily rely on their intact limb. And again, these asymmetries may increase the risk of a fall. So where do we go from here? Well, it may be helpful to know the relative times of the peak angles. When we saw these peak angles, we don't know if they occurred when the amputee or control was fully sitting, fully standing, or sometime in between. So if we can know the relative time of these peak angles, it might help to paint a larger picture. And similarly, if we knew the direction of the X-range excursion, it might also help to paint a larger picture. So in the amputees, we don't know if the Y-range excursion occurred towards or away from the intact limb. So if we are able to analyze that type of data, it might again paint a larger picture of where their balance is shifting to. It also would be helpful to compare our ertl amputees and controls to Burgess amputees when making these sit-to-stand transitions. That would really help to show the differences in ertl and Burgess amputees functionally post-operative. Also to look at the mechanics of a true ankle joint and try and mimic that even further in a prosthetic ankle joint. And finally, find better sit-to-stand strategies for amputees to use now, whether this be through therapy or any other technique. Here are the references that I used. And the people I would like to acknowledge, I'd really like to thank my mentor, Abby Ferris. She really helped me and encouraged my immense curiosity throughout this entire project. I would like to thank my sponsors, my research sponsor, Peggy Toll from the Edward Madigan Foundation, and my scholar sponsor for allowing me to be here at FSI, Brian Davidson. I'd also like to thank the FSI staff, Lori Ball, Jessica, and Topher for always helping us out, and with our projects and helping us get things done. Thank you.